This panel is about how readers, particularly students, can best recognize truth and how they can, and the pursuit of truth. And this is a big topic for the era we're in, obviously. So right off the bat, I'm going to ask my boss the first question.
Make it good.
It's a good one. Okay. Last weekend, not very long ago, President Trump tweeted that the failing New York Times had made up a phony source when, in fact, the source was a senior White House official speaking on background in the White House briefing room to a room full of about 50 reporters, plus 200 on the phone. How do you, in an era when there is such growing distrust in the media, and it's hard to tell what is truth and what is not, how do you get people to believe us and the Times?
And actually, the answer I'm going to give, I suspect, would be true for any news organization. We have spent, I mean, I'm 61, and I've been in newsrooms since I was 19. I shouldn't say this to this group, but I dropped out of college to go to work in a newspaper. I think as a
pre-Mark Zuckerberg.
I think as a rule, we have not helped ourselves because we're not particularly transparent. I think that we don't let people see how, traditionally, we did not let people see how we make news, how we make decisions. I think it made us feel distant from the readers and elitist. I think the best thing we can do is to be transparent. I think the best thing we can do is to let people in on the process a little more. I think the best thing we can do is to let people see, how we make decisions. I think the best thing we can do is to own up to our flaws. There's nothing more, in my own view, I love newsrooms. I've worked in newsrooms, like half a dozen different newsrooms. And I think newsrooms are wonderfully elegant, deeply flawed places where people make big, hard decisions on extreme deadline and wrestle with really difficult issues with a clock ticking that's unlike almost any other profession I've seen. And I think if we own up to that and let people see it and become more human, I think people will trust us more, to be frank. That's part of it to me. Okay,
let me go to Rebecca, and because of all the educators in the room, all the college educators, let me ask you about college newspapers. Many, if not most, of reporters and editors at the New York Times worked for their college paper, I would say. All of us up here did. No, you didn't? Okay, well, you don't have to. It turns out you can be executive editor. You don't have to work for your college newspaper. I worked for the Daily Northwestern, Michigan Daily, and
Cornell Daily Sun.
Okay. All dailies. So Rebecca, with the decline of local newspapers, what role do you think college newspapers can play in local reporting and also in the topic of the panel, the pursuit of truth?
I actually think that college papers are increasingly essential. And let's just talk about college campuses today. I mean, the battle of facts is happening really on college campuses, and we need to train students to think critically and to prize facts and the pursuit of truth above really anything else. And this is, in the age of social media, something that we can't take for granted. I mean, half of what's on social media is right, half of what's on social media is wrong. And your student newspapers are actually facing a lot of the same struggles that Metro and any press is. There's declining advertising. People aren't wanting to read the print paper anymore, and there's a lot of headwinds. There's been a couple of papers that have closed. Recently, administrators have, it's Southern Methodist University actually took over a student newspaper. Many of the daily papers are not daily anymore. They're only twice a week. And so what I would say to all of you is, try to support your student newspaper. And for administrators on a college campus, it's kind of uncomfortable. I was talking to Dean Martin at the University of Michigan about this just now. When your college paper is attacking you, it's very easy to kind of want to attack them back and to demonize them and perhaps even to take them over or deny funding or something like that. But they're actually doing an incredibly important thing on your college campus. And I think what's also just amazing to me is that the Michigan Daily in Ann Arbor, Michigan is incredibly important to Ann Arbor because the Ann Arbor News doesn't really exist anymore. It's a digital version. And so there are some people, you know, we're doing a lot of thinking in journalism about these local news deserts, and there are some people who think that college newspapers could actually be a solution. Well-funded places that are training, you know, future generations of journalists to the local news deserts that are clearly a problem for the country right now.
Mark, what was your relationship with the administration at Cornell when you were at the...
Well, I mean, I learned the art of the hostile interview at Cornell. I loved the administration, but no, I really did. And I would say two things to piggyback on what Rebecca just said. If your college paper at your university is dying, and many of them are dying, then I would say your university is in dire shape. That a university, a healthy university, needs a vibrant student newspaper. And then secondly, I'd say that if you as an administrator are treating your college paper with contempt, you are doing more that you are essentially teaching the future journalists what you think of the media. So you can give speeches about the freedom of the press and the importance of the media, but it is really, do you take the phone call and are you transparent, and how do you deal with the student press? And I actually think, I really believe in those things, and I majored in biology, and I learned everything I know about journalism from going to the Cornell Daily Sun.
I majored in journalism at Medill, but I learned an awful lot working for the Daily Northwestern, including covering with great relish a tuition hike at the medical school. That was people were out protesting. It was very exciting, you know. So, okay, I'm going to go back to the Times for a bit. Dean, the Times has I think we can agree, a largely liberal readership. We certainly hear from them a lot that we're not liberal enough. And Trump's attacks on the press, and us in particular, have to some degree increased that readership. We've often said that the more he attacks us, the more our readership goes up among liberals. But it's also had a corrosive effect. And many Trump supporters do not read the New York Times. How do we get them to read the New York Times? Do we want them to read the New York Times? And is there a way to reach them?
The first thing I will say is the worst thing that can happen to any news organization, including the New York Times, is to have a homogenous readership. It's not desirable for a lot of reasons. First off, in the short term, it doesn't feel economically sound. But I think in the moral life of a journalistic, I mean, the reason I do not like Fox News is because I don't think they even try. I think they're playing to their base, if you will. I think we try. I think that I believe that not only for the survival of the country, an institution like the New York Times should have a broader audience than it has. My own view is that newspapers, it used to be easier for newspapers to have broad audiences because we did 20 things before the internet. We did 20 things or whatever, but of the 20 things, only 2 or 3 were controversial. The other 17, and the reason when I grew up in New Orleans, everybody read the Times-Picayune, no matter what their politics. The 17 that we told you whether it was going to rain. We told you whether your ball team won or lost. We told you whether the city council voted yes or no to the supermarket down the street. There was this body of stuff that was purely objective, that was not controversial. And then there were 2 or 3 things that were truly controversial, and you loved the 17, you didn't worry about the 3. The 17 actually got taken away from newspapers. That's the way the world worked. If you're still reading your print newspaper to tell you whether it's going to rain or not, if the first time you find out whether your university's football team won the game last night is from your print newspaper, all those things we used to do. So what we're left with, a lot of, is the stuff that's controversial. I think that my own view is the way that the New York Times has to broaden its audience, and some of it is stuff the editorial page has done, and it's upset some of our readership. You have to get other voices. Our job is not to reinforce what you think. Our job is to give you, it's okay for the editorial page, for instance, to have a point of view, but it really should also give you different voices so you can make up your own mind. I think the news report should strive very hard, especially in covering the things that are not as controversial, like business and culture, and to try to tell people the truth, to check your strong opinions at the door. And I think that's the way we gain audience. I actually think if people read the New York Times closely, and I would say the same of the Washington Post and the Wall Street Journal, I think they would see a broader report than they would expect.
If I could jump in here, I think one of the most positive things that's happened in the past year or two is that people have realized that there's a value in news, and more people are now paying for subscriptions than ever before. We were kind of waiting for this moment to happen in journalism, and the Times is now up to almost 3 million digital subscribers. That's more than any newspaper in the world. That was unfathomable a couple of years ago. I'm on the board of the Columbia Journalism Review, and people are really realizing that there's a value in journalism. And this is something that we struggled with for many years. And I think in a sense, and you've said this, Steve, many times, our sense of mission has never been greater. The Harvey Weinstein stories, and we should congratulate, by the way, Elizabeth. She picked up a Pulitzer today.
Well, the reporters picked up the Pulitzer, not me. Okay.
Elizabeth is our Washington bureau chief who headed up coverage of the Russia investigation. And you think of all of the painstaking work that has been done to break story after story on that over the past year, and it's not cheap, but people are realizing that there's real value in fact-based news. What our challenge is, and we could use your suggestions, is how to get younger people to realize that as well. But I think there's some positive indications that they really have recognized that.
Let me ask you about younger people. We know that younger readers get most, if not all, of their news from social media, and we also know after 2016 that there were Russian bots all over Facebook. How do you tell students how to distinguish between what is truth and what is not? I mean, how do you know what is true? Mark, you want to try that?
Well, I mean, one new journalistic form that we now rely on quite frequently is a fact check, and we do this because there is so much out there that is around that's in your feed that looks accurate. The graphics are wonderful. The text looks like it came from some trusted source, and it's made up. And so we spend a lot of time just sort of saying what is out there and what the truth is. And we did it the other day with all of the misinformation that was out on social media about immigration and separating immigrant children from their parents, and there were photos from the Obama years that were purported to be recently taken, and there was just all this misinformation. And so we bring a reporter who knows the issue cold, who has studied the issue, who sort of tells you, here are the facts. And I think that's just, the other key thing for my staff, that, national staff, is we go to the places. So there's a lot of places where you can read aggregation, someone sitting at their desk telling you what's on Twitter. We send reporters to the scene. And one of the stunning things, Dean was a national editor back in the day, and never once has he said, are you sending too many people? It's always, is that enough? And so we sent 20 reporters to a project in Chicago to write about the violence over Memorial Day. A school shooting will happen, and I'll send a dozen, and Dean will sort of look at me at, is that enough people? And so we're on the scene, we're talking to people firsthand, we're trying to figure out what really is going on.
The platforms have some responsibility too. I mean, Facebook, Twitter, and Google, I think, also have responsibility to come up with a way. I think to be frank, I think they grew quickly without thinking about this. I think they have a responsibility to make sure that what's on their platforms are responsible and truthful too. It shouldn't only be ours. Can I comment on something that Rebecca said, that that I want to make sure we have time to talk about. She mentioned college papers and the responsibilities that college papers have in an era when local news is on the decline. I'm not worried about the future of the New York Times or the Washington Post or the Wall Street Journal. I think we'll have ups and downs, but I think we sort of have figured out a formula, generally speaking. I think that local news is in the middle of, just to my mind, a crisis that's bad for the country. It's going to be bad for American cities. It's going to be devastating for American suburbs. It's going to be bad for local business. It's going to be bad for your universities. I think you're going to get to the point where entire large swaths of America will not have local newspapers. I think local newspapers are going to start collapsing in the next year or two. I think these cuts you're seeing in Denver and other places, that's not going away. I think cultural institutions won't be covered. I think that one of the biggest cultural and selfishly journalistic issues we need to talk about more is the decline of local news organizations. I mean, I think it's an absolute crisis. I think at my table we were talking about how to get more coverage for local universities. Picture the day not too long from now where there might not be a local newspaper in your city. That's going to happen. I mean, that's inevitable, and that can't be stopped. And so far, nobody has come up with, to my mind, satisfying models for covering some of this. People will cover, if the papers in Silicon Valley go away, yeah, people will cover Silicon Valley. There will be a way to draw ad dollars and readers to a very affluent part of America. I don't know who's going to cover Detroit if the Detroit papers go away. I don't know who's going to cover, Queens if there's no. I mean, this is something I think universities can really help with.
And I would just amplify David Axelrod's point earlier, the silos of information that, I think people feel like, well, I read Facebook, I'm on Twitter, so I know what's going on. But I think now we realize, how manipulated that is, perhaps even, well, definitely by Russian bots and many state actors, but it's even more perniciously, in a sense, it's our comfort zone, it's our belief zone, and we're not really having that experience of, an old-fashioned front page where you might see things that you might not agree with, or an opinion page, and that ultimately is something that's very damaging.
Okay, can you hear me? Okay, you can hear this one. We have about 10 minutes left for questions, so if you just raise your hand and identify yourself. No one has a question in this entire group? Okay, yeah. Right there in the middle.
As we're waiting for a question, I wanted to say one thing, that if Elizabeth looks familiar, it's because she is she's sort of the star of the Showtime Fourth Estate movie about the New York Times. And so if you're bored in your hotel room tonight, you should watch the 4-hour documentary.
4.5 hours, if you think 4.5 hours of the New York Times, it's a big commitment.
No, it's more than that.
No, it just seems like it. Right. Okay, the gentleman in the middle here had a question.
I got it first. Oh, hello.
Here.
Hello. Hi. Jane Sullivan from NYU. How can we work with the New York Times?
In which ways? You mean how can you get more coverage in the New York Times?
I can take that if you want.
Go ahead. She's volunteered to take it. That's great.
You can send us your journalists. It used to be that there was a great feeder system of local news organizations. And I had a business and econ coverage, and it's been really hard to find people who both understand business and economics and know how to write news stories. And so I think that I feel like we're heaping all of these things on you to a certain extent, but the training of the future journalists who are going to work at the Times and BuzzFeed and whatever else exists in 5 or 10 years is really, it comes down to universities increasingly. And we would, we're involved with CUNY, we're involved with, Dean, you went to Wayne State last year. We're trying to fan out across the country. Mark, you go to lots of schools, but we're really intent on finding talent at universities.
I'll add one. because to be frank, I don't think this is something journalism teachers are good at today. Teach them to be inquiring and not so goddamn certain. There's nobody more certain than the American journalism professors today. I've never seen anything like it. Teach them to be inquiring. Inquiring does not mean, it doesn't mean you can't develop a point of view, but it just means you want to understand things and you have empathy and inquiry. I would go back to your telejournalism schools to stop opining all over the place and develop a little more empathy and understand and inquiry.
Over here. There's here. You want to grab the mic?
No, I think.
You can have ours.
But you have to answer the question.
Sorry.
A system head always has an answer. So,
Who are you?
Eli Oakley, I'm the chancellor for the California Community Colleges. My question goes back to the issue of elitism. So, there is a growing trend in this room where those of us associated with higher education, particularly universities, selective universities, that it's creating a divide in America. They feel that that is a part of the elitism that is undercutting the country. And to some extent, that's associated with organizations like the New York Times. So my question is, since we're all in this room, how do we begin to combat that together? And also, the role of community colleges rarely comes up in these conversations. And community colleges are the only segment of higher education that actually polls well across America. And I think primarily because most Americans see the community colleges as a place where they can actually go to rather than a selective university that they never see themselves at. Also, they hear voices in the community college that reflect their experience. So how does the New York Times better reflect the experiences of most Americans like those in the community colleges rather than, at least the perception is, appealing to those only coming from the selective universities?
The perception is not inaccurate. I mean, I think the New York Times, like a lot of news organizations, but I'll only speak for mine. I think the New York Times needs to be more diverse in the backgrounds of its journalists. We've started a program in the last, and we've gone on a hiring spree over the last year and a half. That was, before that we did a very difficult round of buyouts so that we could hire. I think we need a staff that doesn't, that has a different educational backgrounds. I mean, I made a particular effort, for instance, to hire people who'd been in the military, because generationally and by background, and because there hasn't been a draft, obviously, we did not have, I couldn't find anybody in the newsroom who had served in the military, so we went out and hired 3 people right away who had served in the military. I think we need people from different economic backgrounds. I mean, when I said that I don't believe a news organization can survive morally, let alone economically, by having one kind of reader, I don't think you can cover America if you don't look and feel like the rest of America. I think for me, it's different kinds of hiring. It's making sure that we should write about community colleges more. We should have people who've spent time on the campuses of community colleges. I don't disagree with that, and I think we're trying, and we just need to keep trying.
I might just add that I think the cost of education is something that's really a concern across the country. It's something we're going to talk a lot about, Frank, tomorrow. There are interesting different models of education that are emerging. Community colleges are one of them. I'm from a mid-Michigan, where we were just talking over dinner, where college is kind of flipped, and most kids now go to community college instead of four-year college. And a lot of that is because of the cost of education, and that is a seismic shift in many communities, and community college does offer opportunities to people, and I think you raised an excellent point.
Yeah, Carl Strickwerda, I'm president of Elizabethtown College. A lot of us are really worried about the decline of local newspapers. It's particularly, I think, it's particularly true in these states where the capital city, like I'm from Pennsylvania, where the capital city is not the site of a major, is not a major city. So Philadelphia Inquirer has enough struggles just to cover Philadelphia. They don't cover Harrisburg, and that's true in a lot of states. You know, Lansing, Jefferson City, all kinds of states. The capital city is under the radar right now. The big city newspapers aren't covering it. So and we don't want to do national, international. That's you and the Post and so on. So one of the things a lot of us are working on are these kind of online magazines, MinPost, Texas Tribune. We're trying to start one in Pennsylvania. But the issue for us a lot of times is how do we get that expertise that something like the Times can afford, or the Post and so forth, but we don't have. But that's the only way we're going to get local higher education issues, the issues that really affect the states, because otherwise you have all the, I mean, you know, put it in political terms, that's really where the revolution in American politics has happened in the last 10 years, has been at the state level, right? I mean, the Trump phenomena is a product of 10 years of grassroots work, which went under the radar screen of the national media, but it went under the radar screen of a lot of local newspapers too, because they were all going down and shutting down. I mean, the local newspapers by us are most of them are either closed or they're not weeklies anymore. They're weeklies instead of dailies. But we're looking for ways to make those kind of online websites really vibrant and things that people are going to really use.
First off, I will say I know a lot of unemployed journalists because so many news organizations seriously have gone out of business. I mean, if you have a journalism school, I would make sure that there are people on the faculty who are practitioners. There was a movement in the last decade or so that I think got overdone to build journalism schools around people who really weren't practitioners, and I think it would be helpful to have more practitioners in the work in the mix. You know, I look for chances to partner with local news organizations myself. We just did a major project with the New Orleans Times-Picayune, and I've sort of sent the signal that I'd like to do more projects with other news organizations. I think it's going to take time. I would be surprised if you found it hard if you reached out to some of the journalism organizations to get access to people who have expertise. There are a lot of people who've lost their jobs, retired early. I mean, just in the 5 newspapers I've worked at, I can think of a lot of people in that category.
Maybe one more. We're out of time. I don't want to. A lengthy panel after dinner, I know, is a drag.
A couple more.
We can go for a couple more hours if you want.
How, right here in the front here. Yeah. Okay.
Well, thank you. Martin Bourgois, Skidmore College. In terms of the college newspaper, I think a lot of colleges and universities are also struggling with trying to make sure the facts are heard. College papers tend to rush out, and the frenetic pace of news means that they'll go out with something, you'll pick it up, and now colleges start scrambling to fix a story that could have been fixed at the outset. How can papers like yours ensure that at least they have due diligence and that they check the facts before you pick it up and run with it?
Oh, that's an excellent question. I mean, student newspapers, I mean, Mark and I were saying yesterday, and it may horrify you slightly, that we didn't take a formal journalism class, right? But we learned at the school newspaper. I think that it is the first draft of history, and there's no question it's sometimes written by students who are learning on the job. But the peer-led education of journalists at student newspapers is something that really works. And I would encourage you to, to develop a bit of a thick skin, to get to know the editors, to, to have a dialogue, and to really try to resist the urge to, to shut down the lines of communication.
Let me clarify that. It's not that we're trying to shut it down. I can tell you from a personal experience from a prior institution that I worked for, I worked very closely with the editor-in-chief. We'd be on the phone at 11 o'clock at night, midnight, just to correct that. So, we opened the line of communications to the point that when I left, they pointed to that as something that really helped them.
Right.
However, my question is about external newspapers picking up what they see on their site without checking with the institution and running with it. Well, sometimes it's incorrect because they too are in a hurry to post something. I love working with them. I worked as a journalist before. I love it. But I think there's a problem here.
Yeah. I mean, that's just bad journalism, really, to be picking things up because someone else printed them and published them as your own. And we clearly, if other outside so-called professional news organizations are covering things that the student paper got wrong, that's just a collapsing. You just have to have contacts to the editor, point it out. There's no magic solution, but a vibrant student press is essential. It just really is, and there will be errors. I mean, we make errors every day, but we fess up to them. Read the corrections page. There are, and we correct tiny things. We correct just small things, and we fess up to mistakes as we make them. And
the advantage of digital is actually that when there are mistakes, they can be corrected and notes could be appended. And I would be very surprised if student journalists weren't open to that and to acknowledging that, because that's what we and others do on stories. That transparency is something that's incredibly important, and is a lesson for all journalists to learn.
One more question back here.
Thank you. Ramaj Qureshi, president of Portland State University. I just came back last night from China, and I looked at, I was attending a conference on big data. 50,000 people were at that conference. And the government of China has spent 1 trillion RMB on big data. My question is, what does a media like Times should do to educate the public that we are not investing in the directions that we should be? And instead, we are talking about college education is not necessary.
I agree with you that the rise of China, and particularly China's advances in technology, are probably one of the biggest stories of our time. I worked in China. I had the opportunity to do that for almost 4 years. And I think many here are not really up on, we're very proud of Silicon Valley in America, but China has upped the ante in a way that, and they don't have the protections for data and privacy concerns that we do. The Chinese government is spending $6 billion to develop AI. And as you point out, we are basically talking about saving coal-fired power plants here. So this is a really big issue. I can tell you at the Times, we are investing big on tech. We have hired a lot of tech journalists over the past year, added 3 in China alone. And we are aggressively covering this story. I think there are really important questions that our country needs to ask about investment in technology, and quite frankly, some of the tariffs and the protectionism that you're reading a lot about now. We could end up, I think, in a world where there's a Chinese system, and a U.S. system, and China is the biggest market, and Western companies could have a very, very difficult time competing in China after the past couple of months. So I hear you, and I will just tell you that we think that tech, if we weren't writing so much about Trump, we would be writing even more about tech.
Okay, so thank you to the panel.
Thank you.